Welcome to the Real News Network. My name is Gregory Wilpert, and I'm coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. Earlier this year, the so-called Panama Papers were released, and they created a big splash in the world's media. The reason, of course, was that they showed how the world's rich and famous are hiding their assets in offshore tax havens and thereby evading paying taxes. The issue, though, over the following months gradually became forgotten, and now, only a couple of weeks ago, the government of President Rafael Correa decided to call attention to it again. And what he's doing is he's proposing an ethical pact. That is, he wants to put the issue on a referendum for the February presidential elections, where people will be asked whether or not they favor the outlawing of the holding of offshore assets for people who hold public office. So with us, joining us to discuss this issue is Foreign Minister Guillaume Long. He has been Foreign Minister since March of this year. Before that, he was Minister of Culture, and he holds a PhD in International Studies from the University of London. Thanks so much, Minister Long, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the interview. My pleasure.
So let's start with the problem. That is, to what extent is the issue of offshore tax havens and tax evasion a problem for a country such as Ecuador?
I think it's a huge problem for a country such as Ecuador. I think it's actually a problem for the world. It's a global, systemic phenomenon. I think it affects all countries. It affects developed countries as well. We know that there's huge capital flows and flight leaving a number of nations, and even in the European context and the North American context, tax evasion is pretty widespread, and it affects the social contract. It affects inequality, poverty reduction programs, so on and so forth, pretty much everywhere in the world. In fact, President Charles de Gaulle in France in the 1960s was from a very kind of conservative capitalist, pro-capitalism standpoint, was a notorious critic of a number of tax havens that surrounded France, which is traditionally a strong state with kind of an important role given to taxes, and so on and so forth. And so even from a very kind of pro-capitalist standpoint, there's a contradiction there and a double standard that prevents even the most wealthy countries from carrying out what they should be carrying out in terms of wealth distribution, in terms of social program, and also in terms of growth, in terms of economic dynamism, job creation, so on and so forth. But if this is a problem for wealthy countries, it is evidently an even greater problem for countries that are in dire need of resources in order to achieve development. And certainly in Latin America and the Caribbean, and certainly in the case of Ecuador, it's a very, very serious problem. We believe that roughly, an equivalent to roughly mounting to 30% of our GDP. Ecuadorian GDP is $100 billion, a little bit more. So an equivalent of 30% of our GDP is a little bit over 30 billion, 33, 35 billion dollars is currently hidden in these tax havens. I think the word hidden is appropriate because it's capital that through all sorts of kind of secretive practices is basically evading taxes, tax dodging, and also unaccountable for and kind of hidden. Nobody really knows what's going on. So these are very approximate figures. Now you can imagine what 35 billion, 30% of our GDP would mean for Ecuador in terms, if it was injected in, if it was invested in our country in terms of economic dynamism, job creation, all this work that we're trying to do to diversify our economy, to have a substantive qualitative leap from an economy which currently depends much too much on raw materials, a primary economy, to an economy that could be much more sophisticated, industrialized, could depend much more on what we're trying to achieve, which is a knowledge-based economy, etc., etc. So all these things, and I'm not even talking about poverty reduction and inequality reduction, inequality being the greatest problem in Latin America. Latin America is the most unequal continent in the world, and tax dodging plays a huge role in that inequality. So I think it's a systemic phenomenon. It's a problem for all countries, but it's obviously a problem for the countries that most need resources, that most need liquidity, that most need public action and public policies, public action, is done through, well, a major aspect of the social contract, which is paying taxes. And so, which I think this is why it has been such a recurrent aspect, such an important aspect of our political discourse over the last few years. And of course, with the issue of the Panama Papers and the issue being back on the front page of the newspapers and being back in kind of global political discourse and global political debate, we're jumping on that bandwagon, proudly so, in order to have first this referendum in February of next year, but also a global debate on the issue of tax havens.
So, as I said in the introduction, the idea is to put on a referendum in February the question on whether or not it should be illegal for people who hold public office in Ecuador to have assets in tax havens. I'm wondering, why put this on as a referendum? I mean, after all, the government of President Correa has over something like a two-thirds majority or supermajority in the National Assembly. Why not turn it into law right away? I mean, the idea is then to, after the referendum, which is just consultative, then to take a year to actually pass the law. Why not just pass the law directly?
Well, I think, first of all, a referendum is a measure that you can take in order to politicize things more and in order for the people to have direct voice in a very important issue. It's true, of course, we have a very active National Assembly, a legislative branch that has a lot of participative mechanisms, and so I think that would have been absolutely legitimate. But nevertheless, a referendum sends a signal to the country. This is a direct decision taken by the people in a national plebiscite where we ask the people's direct opinion, not through their representative, but directly through universal suffrage. We think that's important, and this also sends a very strong signal to the world about how serious we are about this matter and how serious we are about wanting to put an end to this global scandal and historic injustice, which is this issue of tax havens. So we also hope that it could become the Correa referendum and be emulated, copied in other parts of the world as something which everybody should aspire to. That's the first, more political reason, I think. Another important reason is that we don't want the opposition to start scapegoating the issue, saying that it's part of some kind of political persecution. Now, it so happens, coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, that a number of members of the opposition, we know, the person who came second in the last presidential elections in 2013 by a 30-point margin, he, I think, if my memory is correct, got 23% of the vote, whereas President Correa got 57% of the vote in the first round of the presidential elections of 2013. This person, a well-known banker, has said he will run again in 2017, and a number of important people on the political opposition have also said that they would be candidates in 2017, and we know a number of them, including this person, have assets in tax havens. And so we don't want to have a law now banning public officials, civil servants, and elected politicians from running or from being in office if they have tax havens before the February 2017 elections, because the argument is going to be this is a ploy to bar us from public office, when it is not actually a ploy to bar them from running public office. It's actually a very well thought out ethical pact, which is what we call it in Ecuador, the ethical pact, for people who have legitimate political aspirations to actually act accordingly, be patriotic, not say they're going to defend the interests of their country but then take all their money and hide it outside, which clearly gravely affects the interests of their country. So that's of course the real intent, and we don't want this smokescreen to overshadow this crusade, noble cause, whatever you want to call it, the ethical pact that we want Ecuadorians to engage with in 2017. So the idea is they can run in 2017 for public office, these people, these opposition figures, some of which we know have assets in tax havens. They can run for presidency, vice presidency, National Assembly, which is the equivalent of our legislative branch, our Congress. But if the referendum passes, if we win, if the Ecuadorian people decide that they want an ethical pact and they want their politicians to have their money not tax dodging and invested in their country, then all elected officials will have 1 year to bring their assets back to the country. So if this particular banker gets elected in February 2017, there's no problem. But if we win the referendum, if the Ecuadorian people go for the ethical pact and want all assets hidden in tax havens owned by politicians to be repatriated back to the country, to be brought back to their homeland, then this particular banker will have 1 year to bring his assets back into the country. That way there can be no argument for political persecution or for preventing threatening political candidates to run and to defeat us, which is what the framing they were going to do, which they were going to attempt to carry out on this, was clearly that this was not the real reason. No, we're proving here that the real reason is an end to tax haven. And then, well, obviously, if Ecuadorian people decide that we're right, then politicians will have a year to bring their assets back to the country.
But why does it only apply to public servants, people who hold public office? Why not apply to everyone, all the rich, basically, in Ecuador, who might potentially be hiding and evading taxes, hiding assets and evading taxes as a result? Shouldn't that be illegal for anyone, any Ecuadorian, or anyone in the matter of anyone in the world?
Yes, I think this is definitely a first step, because I think you're right in saying that the problem is not just a problem linked to bureaucrats or civil servants or elected politicians. I think that it's a systemic problem that goes way beyond the bureaucratic dimension of it. I do think that it's a very strong signal. I think it tackles corruption, it tackles money laundering, it tackles a number of criminal activities, and I think it's a very strong, powerful signal to want ethics back in politics. I think there's an ethical dimension to politics that we wish to position in this referendum, that we wish to bring to the fore, convince young people that politics doesn't have to be this activity that everybody talks of in pejorative terms, that all politicians are the same and all politicians are corrupt. No, we actually believe that politics can also be about reinstating kind of ethical basics and ethical minimum and minimal ethical standards for a country, and that definitely is implicit, I'd say explicit in that referendum. But I agree that it is only a first step. We're talking here about the end to tax havens. This is a strong political statement. It's also there are also practical issues that have to do with preventing private capital in tax havens, which are problematic. But I think this is a first step towards a strategy which has to be a global strategy, hand in hand with other countries, hand in hand with key aspects of civil society, a number of NGOs that have been struggling for a number of years against tax havens. We all have to come together and put an end to tax havens globally. I think that our international position, and we're going to see this in a number of international fora, has to be to bring an end to tax havens. And obviously our referendum is a part and parcel of that end, of that mission, and I think it should be seen also as a strategy that is part of that global cause.
I wanted to get to the international question in a minute, but first I'm wondering about the practical issue. That is, given the fact that the idea of tax havens, the whole purpose is to hide money, how will you actually know whether somebody, let's say a politician is running for office, actually has some? I mean, we only had these Panama Papers once, and they could just as well go to, the Canary Islands or who knows where else, that there are tax havens all around the world. So how would this be enforced? I mean, what's the practical aspect?
Well, this is I think a very good question. There are a number of technical aspects that will have to be dealt with the tax authorities in Ecuador, the Servicio de Rentas Internas, the SRI, which is actually a very well-regarded tax office. Just as a parenthesis, Ecuador has done a lot in terms of tax transparency and has advanced tremendously in the maximizing tax returns and fighting tax dodging. Just as a backdrop information, in 2006, before our government, total tax returns in Ecuador were 3 billion. The last figures I have are for 2014. They were over 14 billion. So, more than a threefold increase in tax returns. And 92% of that increase is to do with transparency, efficiency, and tax collection, not tax increase. And that's very important. Only 8% of that threefold increase in tax returns under the presidency of President Correa has to do with tax increases. And 92% is actually getting people who weren't paying taxes but should have been paying taxes by law to finally pay their taxes. So there's a trajectory there in terms of fighting tax evasion and tax dodging, which we've done nationwide, and now we hope to extend to for it to become an international strategy. But you're right, it's not necessarily going to be that easy. But I think that elements such as the Panama Papers, an increasing amount of leaks, the fear of getting caught out is already showing that a number of Ecuadorians are bringing their money back to Ecuador. And I think that we'll see over the next few months, before the referendum has even been passed, that our strategy is already being fruitful, certainly in economic terms, in terms of capital returning to Ecuador, either because the owners of that capital have political aspirations and they're thinking, oh, maybe I'll run, maybe I won't, maybe, and therefore they're thinking, I better have my money here because I might get caught out either through a leak or through a government investigation or through all sorts of different, or because global governance is changing. There's certainly some efforts, even in the OECD. In the OECD countries, there's a fight for greater transparency. It's not what we want. Ecuador's calling for an end, a total ban, if you like, of tax havens. But certainly certain countries who have a less decisive approach to tax havens is talking about greater transparency. And that could link to ways from Ecuador to make sure that we know who has money where. And if that happens, and you're running for a public office, then you're going to get caught out. So I think there are technical aspects to it, but broadly speaking, we're already seeing people, getting a little bit cold feet in terms of hiding their money in tax havens, and already I think we're seeing capital flows in terms of money returning to Ecuador, which is one of the. There's a major ethical dimension to this, but there's also an economic dimension. $30 billion hidden abroad, which could do a great deal for economic growth, for job creation, for greater dynamism in our economy. So I think in that sense it already is a success.
I guess you could say that the fact that politicians are running for, millionaires are running for public office is a silver lining for this effort to catch them and to get them, make sure that they pay their taxes. But moving on to the question of the international dimension. This week, the non-aligned movement is meeting in Venezuela, in Margarita Island. Are there plans to push this issue on the part of Ecuador at that meeting, or are you waiting for a later time, or what's going on in terms of the international aspect?
We're slowly starting. The Ethical Pact is a new, as in the Ethical Pact in inverted commas, declared by President Correa in his speech to National Assembly, is relatively recent. It was first declared on the 24th of May in a kind of equivalent of a State of Union address, a yearly presidential address to our National Assembly. We've also had now this kind of public broadcast televised address by the president to the Ecuadorian people, announcing his intention to have this referendum. And so foreign policy is now picking up on this. I've spoken to a lot of my colleagues in the region, to a lot of foreign ministers. I've sent personal letters to foreign ministers and heads of state, telling them about the fact that this is going to be a cornerstone of Ecuadorian foreign policy in the coming year. And certainly we're taking this issue to all the different multilateral fora in the world, to all the different multilateral meetings we're having. We also think it's a human rights issue. So recently in Geneva I had an address in the Human Rights Council, because often the framing of it's not a human rights issue, this is a strictly economic issue. So human rights are only civil and political. Well, actually, human rights have a lot to do with development. Human rights have a lot to do with access to education, health, and so on and so forth, which is clearly a product of paying taxes. So we're framing it as something systemic, structural, transversal, that is integral to the capitalist system. And is part and parcel of the double standards that peripheral countries such as Ecuador have to live with, and we don't want to live with anymore. So yes, we'll be taking it to the non-live, we'll be taking it to the UN General Assembly, we're taking it everywhere. I've just been to, a number of places, but I've just went to the Vatican, and we took it to the Vatican because we also think that Pope Francis's message on a more human face to capitalism and fighting against all the kind of crony practices and corruption, and also I would say neoliberalism as a credo, as a pretty fundamentalist dogma. And neoliberalism has been a real stimulus to tax havens. I mean, the number of tax havens has tripled since Reaganomics were first introduced in the early 80s. I mean, there's a direct correlation between the ideology of neoliberalism and the practice of hiding your money in tax havens. And what's interesting is different countries have got different motivations. And so in Europe and the United States, there's a lot of talk there's a lot of talk of fighting terrorism or fighting organized crime through cracking down on tax haven. Whereas here we're talking, obviously we're happy with the idea of fighting terrorism and organized crime, of course we are, but the issues much more linked in Latin America and in the global south with issues related to global justice, tax justice, development, so on and so forth. So if we can, but these motivations are not mutually exclusive. They can feed on each other. They could mean that countries with different interests fight for a mutual cause, and so wherever we go, I think the conjuncture, the historic moment we're at, and the fact that we've just had a lot of noise around the Panama Papers is a good moment to face this issue internationally and to build a broad coalition in order to fight tax havens. It's not going to be easy. Some countries are clearly, I would say, openly defending the notion of tax havens. Last year, in the UN Conference on Financing for Development in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, we saw a group of countries defending the notion of tax havens, whereas a majority of countries from the global south, but also from some European nations, were clearly saying we need more transparency, and some were actually saying we need no more tax havens, which is the position we're going to espouse. But yeah, I mean, it's not going to be easy. There are a lot of economic interests, and global elites created these tax havens in the first place in order to be able to hide their money. And some of these elites are in positions of political power and positions of political decision-making, and therefore are not necessarily going to put an end to tax havens from one day to the next. If you think of the creation of the modern nation-state in the 18th and 19th century, the modern European nation-state, a lot of strong states are literally surrounded by tax havens. I would argue in those days, even so that elites wouldn't have to travel too far. The closest one to the closest border. So you had one in the north, one in the east, one in the west, one in the south. Countries like France and Germany that have kind of traditionally capitalist countries, but kind of a strong statist tradition, are surrounded by tax havens. I think that says a lot about what elites have done in the kind of double standards. Governing. But themselves kind of hiding their money. And I think that illustrates how difficult that struggle is going to be. But I'm confident in the 21st century we can finally put an end to this shameful practice. In a way, a practice which is completely incompatible with the modern institutions of modern capitalism.
Well, we've reached the end of our interview, but Thanks so much for explaining this issue. I think this is really something I'm going to continue to follow. So again, thanks so much for agreeing to this interview.
Well, thank you very much. My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.